The United States has already deployed a carrier strike group into position. Airspace is controlled. Naval presence is overwhelming. And yet, forces are now moving closer. Marines are preparing for rapid assault operations. Which means one thing. This isn't stabilization anymore. This is the final phase. Because controlling the region is not the same as controlling the corridor. The corridor is where everything still matters. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically constrained waterways on Earth. At its narrowest point, it compresses global trade into a passage just over 30 kilometers wide. But ships do not get that full width. They are funneled into fixed shipping lanes. One lane for inbound traffic, one lane for outbound traffic. They are separated by only a few kilometers. And inside those lanes, there is no flexibility. Massive oil tankers, some carrying over 2 million barrels of crude, move through this corridor every day. They don't turn quickly. They don't stop easily. Once they enter the strait, their path is almost entirely fixed, which means even a small disruption can affect everything behind it. One delay becomes multiple delays. One obstruction becomes a chain reaction. A single vessel slowing down forces every vessel behind it to adjust, and in a corridor like this, adjustments don't stay local, they spread. That is what makes this environment different. From the outside, it looks like control has already been established. Carrier aircraft dominate the skies. Surveillance systems track movement across the region in real time. Naval forces maintain a constant presence around the perimeter. On paper, that should be enough. But Hormuz doesn't operate on paper, it operates on proximity, because there are still positions that sit just outside of continuous control. Small islands positioned along the shipping corridor, coastal areas with direct line of sight into the lanes, narrow approach routes where movement can be influenced without being obvious. These are not large visible targets. They don't stand out on a map, but they matter. Because from those positions, you don't need overwhelming force to create disruption. You need timing. You need proximity. You need the ability to act at exactly the right moment. And that is what makes them difficult to deal with. Aircraft can strike them, ships can monitor them, but neither can control them continuously, and that creates a gap. A gap between visibility and control. Everything can be seen, but not everything can be held. And in a corridor like this, that difference matters, because control is not about knowing what is happening, it is about being able to influence it in real time. That is the shift happening now, because when a carrier strike group starts moving closer, it is not just repositioning, it is compressing the environment, reducing the distance between detection and response, reducing the time between movement and reaction, reducing the margin for error to almost nothing. And that alone begins to change behavior, because once reaction time shrinks, decisions become more constrained, options disappear, but even that still is not enough. Because presence from the sea and air does not fully solve the problem. It limits it, it pressures it, but it does not eliminate it. That's where the Marines come in, because Marines don't operate at a distance. They operate inside the space itself. They insert into positions that ships can't hold. They move into areas that aircraft can't control continuously. And they do it quickly. Rapid assault operations are not about scale. They are about precision. Small units, short timelines, clear objectives. Insert, secure the position, neutralize what matters, withdraw before the environment shifts. No permanent footprint, no extended exposure, just enough presence to change the equation. Because in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, you don't need to control everything. You just need to control the points that influence everything else. Those points are rarely obvious, they're not always large, but they sit at the intersections of movement and access. A small island positioned near a shipping lane, a coastal position overlooking a narrow passage, a location that can influence timing without needing to dominate space. Control those and the entire system shifts, because movement becomes predictable, options become limited, decisions become constrained, and that's what control actually looks like. Not overwhelming force, but reduced uncertainty. That's what's being built here, because up to this point, the operation has been about reach. How far forces can project, how quickly they can respond, how much pressure they can apply from a distance. Now, it becomes about proximity. How close forces can get, how precisely they can operate, how effectively they can influence the environment from within it. And proximity changes everything. Because once forces are operating closer, reaction time disappears, targets have less time to move, decisions have to be made faster, mistakes happen more quickly and are harder to recover from. That compresses the entire system, which increases pressure, and pressure forces outcomes. That's why this phase matters, because it's not about escalation, it's about resolution. The final steps needed to turn influence into control, because as long as those last positions remain, so does instability. And instability in a place like this does not stay contained. It spreads outward, through shipping routes, through insurance markets, through global energy systems that depend on this corridor staying open. A single disruption does not just affect one vessel, it affects everything behind it, everything connected to it. And that is where the risk becomes global. Because what happens inside this narrow stretch of water does not stay there. It moves outward, into pricing, into supply chains, into decisions made far beyond the region itself. That is why almost controlled is not enough. Not here, because this system does not operate on partial certainty. It either functions or it does not. And right now it is close, but not fully there. That is why forces are moving now, not because the situation is collapsing, but because it is approaching resolution. And that is the moment where precision matters most. Because once those final gaps are addressed, everything stabilizes. Movement becomes predictable. Risk decreases. The system begins to function normally again. Until then, it does not. That is what defines this phase. The carrier strike group moves closer, not to start something new, but to reduce distance, to increase pressure, to close the space where uncertainty still exists. And the Marines prepare, not for large-scale operations, but for precise ones. Because in the end, control is not decided by how much force you bring. It is decided by where you apply it and how quickly you can act once you are there. And right now, that is exactly what is changing. The operation is not expanding, it is tightening, focusing on the last variables that have not been controlled yet. Because once those are addressed, the system stops being unstable and starts being predictable. And in a corridor like this, predictability is everything. That is why this moment matters, because it marks the shift from pressure to control. And once that shift is complete, everything else follows.